around, heaven knows what all buzzing around. So that, I think, is from a very experienced churchman. Montaigne had been Pius XII's de facto chief of staff for almost 15 years. He knew everything that was going on, and he understood that there was a lot beneath that seemingly placid surface that needed to be brought to the surface and focused, out of which would hopefully come revitalized evangelical energy. The second busted myth, or broken myth, or exploded myth here, I hope, as you read through the analysis of the 5 key documents of Vatican II here, is that the Council was principally intended to reconfigure Catholicism internally, to redo the authority structure of the Church. So this is not true. The Council did ask the Church to think about itself in a different way. That phrase that had become standard in preconciliar ecclesiology, the Church is a societas perfecta, this legal, juridical understanding of the Church, does not appear in the dogmatic constitution on the Church of Vatican II. Instead, there are over 50 biblical images of the Church. There's a very rich development of Pius XII's description of the Church as the mystical body of Christ. There's a very important reflection on holiness as everyone's vocation in the Church, not just the clergy. So yes, the Council enriches and develops the Church's self-understanding, but that is all in aid of evangelization and mission. And indeed, the Council's call to engage modernity was to engage in order to convert. And I said at the beginning, as I said at the beginning, in the second meta-irony, to put modern aspirations to freedom and solidarity and prosperity on a firmer philosophical and indeed theological foundation. And that intention, I believe, reaches its first maturity in the new evangelization of John Paul II, which is embodied in a place like this. This place wouldn't exist without this development that we're describing, not only in terms of its place in the Archdiocese of Washington, but its relationship to Opus Dei, which is very much a fruit of this, and so forth and so on. All of this would not be here had it not been for that development. And we need to understand that. I think that gives us some perspective. Understanding that, I think, helps us see that there is no mythical perfect past to which we can return. There is the present, and there's our responsibilities in the present. And I sometimes hear these younger, traditionally oriented Catholics skeptical about democracy and whatnot say, well, I could imagine that I might be able to live happily in the Habsburg Empire. And I responded that in the Habsburg Empire, you would have been a serf. You wouldn't be blogging, you'd be out digging potatoes or something. So, think about that a little bit. The other myth busting that goes on here, this is a little more technically theological, but I think it's of interest. Who knows who Xavier Rinn was? Not Xavier Rinn II. We don't know who he is. But Xavier Rinn was the pen name of an American Redemptorist priest whose real name was Francis Xavier Murphy. And he wrote about Vatican II for the New Yorker under the pen name Xavier Rinn. And during those 4 years, he created this picture of the Catholic good liberals versus bad conservatives, or good progressives versus bad traditionalists. He really locked that into concrete. Because for media people who have no idea what you're talking about when you even use the word ecclesiology, who can't understand what mystical body of Christ, what on earth does that mean? If you say, look, this is like politics, you know? It's like LBJ versus Barry Goldwater, you know? Good liberals, bad conservatives. Then it all falls into place, and then everything gets read through that. The truth of the matter, which we are still living out today, as recently as last month in Rome at the Amazonian Synod, is that the real argument in the church for the past 50 years has been an argument within the reformist camp. And this began during Vatican II, when in the summer of 1964, spring and summer of 1964, between the second and third periods of the council, the actual meetings in Rome in the fall, a fissure opened up within the group of reformist theologians which had kind of driven the action for the first two periods of Vatican II. Put in its most simple way, one group certainly wanted to develop the church's self-understanding, but thought that that should be done in continuity with the tradition of the church. The church doesn't do paradigm shifts. And another gang that said, no, we need to do that, because the only way we're going to be intellectually credible is if we do it. One of the primary figures of the first group would later become Pope Benedict XVI, who talked frequently about a council of continuity, not a council of rupture. You know, an expression of the second group today is the later years of Cardinal Walter Casper and his work at the synods of 2014 and 2015. That's the real argument. The argument is not between the people who think 1962 and on was just a catastrophic mistake that never should have happened, and we ought to go back to the assurance of the past, which in fact never existed, the stability of the past, which in fact never existed. The real argument is between people who want development and continuity and people who really actually believe that we may know more today than what the Bible or what is in the tradition of the church and its magisterium. This was actually said during the 2015 Synod. We know more about the dynamics of marriage than Jesus. And we know more about than St. Paul about what his words in history of St. Paul community. Okay, we're at a very fundamental choice point here. Does Revelation judge history? I mean, is there a fixed body of truth that judges every historical moment? And even as we develop our understanding of that truth and deepen it? Or are we in this boiling, roiling river of history with no fixed reference points, and we just, grab whatever we can to try to keep afloat? That argument broke out, or began to break out, in the summer of 1964, and it's still playing out today. It's playing out within theology departments, it's playing out in seminaries, it's playing out among bishops, and in some respect it's playing out among ordinary, normal Catholic faithful who somehow have drunk the Kool-Aid of the rupture paradigm and don't seem sometimes to understand the implications of what it means to say we know better. Why is any of this of interest or consequence? Well, first, it's hard enough to see the present clearly. That's one of the hardest things to do, is see the moment clearly, unless we see the past clearly. And if we have a distorted or frankly ignorant view of the past, some examples of which I've described tonight, we're just not going to get today right. Because we can learn the essential meaning of today's contestations within the church. Like this argument about do we do paradigm shifts or don't we? if we understand their roots. And I think because this revised view, as I explained towards the end of the book, helps us get the crisis of sexual abuse and malfeasant church leadership into clearer focus. Namely, this is a moment of essential purification so that the church can realize the truth about its fundamental evangelical vocation. We're not going to be able to make the gospel proposal credible in this culture unless we're seen to live what we propose. And that means house cleaning. That means getting our act together. So, those are some thoughts on what this is all about. I hope it's of interest. I've been very pleased by the number of emails I've gotten from people who said, I've read your book, it gives me a lot of hope. Good. I mean, I didn't write it to be a cheerer-upper. I wrote it because I thought it was a contribution to understanding the past. But if it helps cheer people up today, or give them a sense of the future that can be realized, then that's great, and I'm very grateful for that. So, thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions before we go outside. Thank you. Ed McMahon is now wandering around here. Nobody knows who Ed McMahon is anymore. Every time I say Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon, no, Ed Sullivan. Oh, that's right. Ed Sullivan didn't need anybody. Ed Sullivan was Ed Sullivan.
I was going to ask, a lot of the, I'm not sure the implications of this, I'm trying to understand, a lot of the changes people impute to that have occurred in the church since the close of the Second Vatican Council, liturgical, devotional, disciplinary, sacramental, were not part of the council and weren't mandated by the council.
Yeah.
They developed after. And so, do we see what would be the causes of that? And there's sort of also was a toleration of dissent.
Right.
For example, the 1968 Act
Right.
indicated
Right.
Canadian bishops
Yeah.
publicly dissented.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that was something that the church, there certainly were dissenters over the centuries theologically, but it wasn't tolerated as much. And that sort of a toleration of theological diversity of opinion.
Well, diversity of opinion's fine within the framework of orthodoxy. I mean, there are many ways to understand the truth. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think any serious student, for example, of the way liturgical reform was implemented would dare to make the claim that the way this worked out was what the intention was. Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, this is my Catholic Press column next week, passed by a vote of 2,104 to 4. I mean, this was a virtually unanimous business. But it did not mandate poor translations. It did not mandate execrable music. I don't think anyone realized at the time the devastating effect that putting the personality of the priest celebrant at the center of the Eucharistic liturgy would have, which is what you get with a versus populum celebration. I mean, unless the priest has extraordinary, his personality becomes the center of the action. And there's nothing about versus populum in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. That's it's something that could be tried or something, but certainly wasn't mandated. I think that's turning around. I mean, most young priests who have been ordained in the last 10 or 15 years have a very different, I think, far more sacral view. I think our new translations are much better. Musical situation is improved. There are still fingernails down the blackboard moments in some less enlightened parts of the world church. But the but okay, so that's one set of problems. And I think, frankly, that has to be laid at the feet of Paul VI. He just did not keep control of this process the way he ought to have done. Then there was the 60s. Let's remember when all this happened. So the assault on authority in the wake of Humanae Vitae, which was itself a dramatically countercultural statement to the sexual revolution, was virtually guaranteed to produce a big mess. And because the Pope at the time took the decision, for whatever reason, not to, use the whip hand, things did get seriously out of control. And as those of you who have heard me talk about this over the past 17 years know, I think there is a direct relationship between that breakdown of doctrinal and moral discipline and the breakdown of behavioral discipline that manifested itself in this huge spike in really bad behavior. Now, another interesting, if ironic, moment in this is who gives the reins a good tug. Everybody thinks that's John Paul II. It's actually Paul VI. Because in the last great document of his pontificate, an apostolic exhortation called Evangelii Nuntiandi, which was meant to finish the work of the Synod of 1974. This document came out in 1975. He basically says, we have really missed the whole point of the Second Vatican Council. The Church exists to proclaim the gospel. The Church does not exist to be a non-governmental organization in the good works business. The Church does not exist to foment revolutionary violence in Latin America. The Church doesn't exist to say it's one Christian option among other Christian options, or one religious option among other religious options. And Evangelii Nuntiandi really points the direction that would then be taken by John Paul II and Benedict XVI. So at the end, Paul VI, who's been in something since Humanae Vitae and all of that assault, pulls out and comes up with something that's really quite striking, as his one of his associates, who I think probably had a large role in drafting Evangelii Nuntiandi, said was his pastoral testament to the Church. This is what I think we should be doing. And it queued up a lot of good stuff. So, more ironies. But the fact that all of this happened when Western civilization was coming apart at the seams is absolutely part of the problem. I have a long analysis of the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world in here, and I basically say this document was issued up with that right now. Yeah. Mr. Grenfell over here.
Yes, there was something you said early in your talk about some probably nostalgia that Catholics have for some golden age. I wonder if, in fact, if institutions, you're sort of putting down institutions in a way. It seems like institutions are growth from culture. They're sort of reification of culture. And I think that's what some Catholics miss now, is a Catholic culture. We look back only a few generations. Remember when you didn't eat, pride, this sort of thing. And now most Catholics just scoff at that, at least the ones I meet. And so I don't know. I just want your reflections on that.
Well, I mean, look, I don't think it's possible to sustain vibrant Catholic faith for mission unless you are living counterculturally. Nobody's telling you got to have a cheeseburger on Friday. Bernie Sanders probably wishes somebody had done that. You wouldn't have these stents put in. Whatever. Boy, this is a tough crowd. Look, we can, and in fact are, I think, recreating Catholic microcultures. And that's, every place there is a really living and vital church, whether it's a parish or within dioceses or whatever, it's a result of that. And that's where this vitality for mission comes from in the church today. One of the great expressions of the new evangelization in the Catholic Church in the U.S., I believe, is Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, kind of Catholic Peace Corps, where kids give 2 or 3 years of their lives right after graduating from college to go be missionaries on college campuses. Focus is an intact Catholic microculture that then goes out and evangelizes. So I think it's a very good point, Milt. And in fact, it's something that I wrote about during the Synod. And there was an awful lot of I thought, kind of silly talk about enculturation, as if the church goes to different cultures simply to learn from them. That was not Isaac Jogues' view of how you deal with Hurons and Iroquois here, formerly known as savages. But more to the point, it misses the essence of the church. The church is a culture, and the church brings its culture to the cultures it encounters and can draw things from them. That's fine. I think one of the greatest things that has happened in the Catholic Church during some of the messes we've described, is we have discovered in our own worship the culture of Lutheran and Anglican hymnody. Lutheran and Anglican hymns, which are infinitely better than what we were singing in the 50s and 60s, and are a great enricher of Catholic worship today. So that's the Catholic culture absorbing that. Of course, the greatest example of true enculturation in the Western Hemisphere is Our Lady of Guadalupe. This stunningly Mexican or indigenous replication of the Mother of God in a context that can be understood by the people who were to be evangelized. So you're quite right, and this is part of what parishes need to figure out. The parish as sacramental service station is done. People got other options, and they don't feel a sense of obligation. If that parish is not, a microculture within the neighborhood it is, where people not only worship but learn and have an experience of solidarity and an experience of service and all the rest, it just isn't going to work. So, yes, sir. Can you hold on just a second till Ed Sullivan gets back here? No.
You kind of opened the door to my comment a moment ago, but I think it's also important that we be cognizant that we're measuring often the vitality of the church with American lens. It's not the case, it's not dissipating in the world. There's a lot of areas where... Absolutely
right. Absolutely. Well, look, I mean, there's good news and bad news. One of the great graces of my life in all of this synoding of recent years, to become friends with bishops from Africa. There is an enormous freshness and vitality in men who are, in many cases, first-generation Christians. I had a meeting in Rome last month with my old friend Cardinal Francis Arinze from Nigeria, who's now 88 years old. And I am constantly amazed when I'm talking with him. This guy baptized his parents. Lecture, some media work. I'm staying in a parish, kind of normal, middle-class neighborhood of Munich. And I asked the pastor one morning, how many people are in the parish? He said, well, the way we count them here is how many people in the boundaries pay the so-called church tax. And the answer was 10,000. I said, okay, how many are at Mass on Sunday? 200. 2%. And I said, do you invite people back to the sacramental community of the church? And he said, of course. And I said, what do they say? He said, well, a lot of them say, look, I pay the church tax, what else do you want? I mean, this is a total evacuation of any real sense of Catholic identity. So, now, it is always refreshing for me to be in those messes, whether it's the German mess or the Italian mess or the Swiss mess or the British mess or wherever I happen to be. And hear people say, how do you do it in the United States? You're doing so well. How do you get all these good bishops you've got? How do you do something like Focus? You know, how do you have vibrant parishes today? How do you have lay associations of the sort we have here? What's living in the dying Catholic Church in Western Europe looks to the United States for models. I've had several German bishops in my office in the last year, around the corner, saying, who do I need to meet to find out how to do this? So, we can be a little self-obsessed. We should not get self-satisfied. I mean, this new Pew stuff is not good and encouraging data. But at least we are playing better defense right now than others, and in some cases I think we're doing much better offense. I had the occasion to meet with the Pope Emeritus last month for 45 minutes, and he wanted to know about everything. And of course he's a university person, so he wants to know about the universities. And I said at one point to him, it's amazing but true that we're in a kind of golden age of Catholic campus ministry right now. There are a very significant number of really first-class Catholic campus ministries around the country, and they're not in places you might expect to find them. I mean, the one that makes the gold standard is at Texas A&M, Bible Belt, College Station, Texas. They had 5,000 people at Mass on Sunday. They've produced more religious vocations and priestly vocations today in the past 25 years. So there's a lot you're right, there's a lot of good stuff going on, and we need to protect that. And one more, maybe? Yes, ma'am. Yep.
Do you think there is a more acute fall-off in terms of a sense of nostalgia around Vatican II? I mean, this was so helpful today to hear about, that this was not such a break. But for America, was it such a break? When you think about the Catholic Church here, it was an immigrant church with, becoming more and more assimilated with so many things working in the favor of those people and my ancestors and so forth.
Yeah.
The break of Vatican II just seems more acute here.
Well, I often when I'm making this presentation, I bring up exactly the point you made, and I'm sorry I didn't do it, so thank you for doing it. All of this ferment that's described in the book, really from the late 18th century through the 19th century and the early 20th, which was a time of great intellectual vitality in the church. We were largely unaware of that, because we were building institutional Catholicism in the United States, and it was working class and lower middle class people who were doing that. So we kind of missed a lot of this. Now, there were some fusses at Catholic University in the early 20th century over questions of appropriate biblical interpretation and whatnot. But did anybody at, St. Anne's Parish in Tenleytown know that this was going on over in Brooklyn? No. One of the other things that people find fascinating about this, and this is something I learned, the first pope whom most Catholics knew was the Pope was Pius IX. If you would ask the 35,000 Catholics in this country at the founding, who's the Pope? 98% of them wouldn't have a clue. I mean, that was on another planet somewhere. And it's the rise of, popular newspapers and magazines. All of this assault on Pius IX during the Italian Risorgimento made him a very sympathetic figure to a lot of people. The first pope whom people regularly had a picture of in their home was Pius IX. And so this whole business of the Pope at the center of the Catholic imagination, that's something new. And probably is a bit out of size, frankly, today. But no, we missed a lot of this in the U.S. The other thing I didn't realize is that until the mid-20th century, over 50% of the world Catholic population remained in Europe. It's only after the mid-last century that you get this spike in Catholic in Latin America and elsewhere. And of course, the African thing we were talking about is unbelievable. In 1900, there were 1 million Christians in all of Africa. Copts in Egypt, Nestorians in Ethiopia, and Afrikaners in South Africa. That was about it. By the middle of the 21st century, there may be as many as 700 million Christians in Africa, about half of whom will be Catholics. So it's an astonishing business. And what's interesting in light of this Amazon thing, and then I'll stop because I know we have to move on, is that the most appalling moment last month was when this, if I may say, I think this is in charity, slightly batty 85-year-old Austrian bishop named Erwin Krautler, who had spent 34 years as a missionary bishop in the wilds of the Amazonian rainforest, bragged at a synod press conference. This is like in the Holy See press office. Bragged that he had never baptized an indigenous person in 34 years. I mentioned this to Cardinal Lorenzi in our course of our catching up conversation. He said, "What was he doing for 34 years? He was probably complaining about cutting down trees or something." I mean, Africans do not like the notion that we go to indigenous peoples to learn about a right relationship with nature. I mean, they are into conversion, and that's why it's growing. That's why it's growing. So that's going to be a very interesting dynamic in the world church for the rest of the 21st century, how that plays out. And it already had an effect on the synods of 2014, 2015, and 2018, which is where I began to actually interact with a lot of these men and work with them. So, great to see you all. Thank you. Happy end of the church year coming up soon, and a new year of grace beginning. I will be delighted to sign books for you outside. It's never too early to start your Christmas shopping. And let's pray for each other that we all marry disciples we were baptized to be. Thank you.
I'll just keep writing. Military histories. More, yeah, I've read a lot about Islamic law and so forth.
Big subject.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've heard of, they took it off, they actually took it off the shelf. I've read about that at Georgetown University. People have said that the links between the church and the Islamophobia industry have to be severed. I wrote a story called the Islamophobia Index Islamophobics. They actually did that because then they're saying, you shouldn't have Robert Spencer and so forth here on the unbelievable that I got. Yeah, wow, that's well, I was shocked that it happened here. Interesting, wow.